Hello and welcome. I'm Stephen Hawley Martin. In addition to being an author, I'm a ghostwriter, an editor, and I'm the publisher of the Oakley Press, which is a book publishing company now with more than 100 books in print. If you're looking for a publisher, I urge you to get in touch with me. You can do so through my website. You'll find a link in the write-up below this video. Today, I'm speaking with Nelson Kalish, whose book was recently published by the Oakley Press. It's called A Line a Day, The Private Thoughts of a Public Woman. It's about his grandmother, who was an entertainment editor of a major newspaper during the golden age of Hollywood. She interviewed and rubbed elbows with practically all the stars of that era. Stars like Gary Cooper, Clark Gable, Judy Garland. Welcome to the show, Nelson. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Nelson Kalish?
Good morning, Steve, and thank you for the opportunity to do this. I'm Nelson Kalish, actually, but that's okay.
Sorry, I've mispronounced your name.
Not at all. Most people do. I'm a native Richmonder. I'm a baby boomer. I'm 70 years old, and I'm married, but I don't have any kids. I am a retired mental health clinician who worked for the County of Henrico Public Mental Health System for 30 years. I work primarily with adolescents and their families and substance abusing teenagers. I also did a lot of work in the juvenile court system doing mental health and substance abuse evaluations. So that's the short story of who I am.
Well, thank you for being here today. What prompted you to create this book about your grandmother?
My grandmother had 3 children, the youngest of whom was my aunt, Nikki. And Nikki married late in life. She did not have any children. And before she passed away, she asked me to be her executor. So at the time of her death, I was dispersing her worldly goods and came across several volumes of my grandmother's diaries, which not only had my grandmother apparently kept, but my aunt had also. And so I began to read them. And these were diaries that captured the years of her life long before I was born. I was born in 51, and this is a series of diaries that go from 1920 to 1950. And as I read these diaries, it became pretty clear that this was a woman that I really did not know. She was my grandmother, and I knew her for 36 years. But I didn't know this lady. I didn't know the woman who was in these diaries, and it was a total new chapter and page of history of her history in particular that I had no familiarity with. And that's what prompted me to do it.
Well, yeah, I mean, what was she like as a person, at least from your standpoint growing up? I suppose she was one of your grandmothers and you probably went to see her on holidays and things. What was she like?
That's true. But she did live in Richmond, as we did. So we were in close proximity and got to visit, fairly often, more than just holidays. She was, I would say, always a celebrity, if you will. Her local fame and her local prominence, I guess you'd say, because she was a columnist and well-read and well-known in the Richmond community. She always seemed to have something to say about some encounter with somebody in her industry. She was loquacious. She could be long-winded. She usually kind of sucked up most of the air in the room because her life was very much different than everybody else's. And it was, I think, just generally more interesting than anyone else's. Simply put, if you asked her what was new, she would tell you. And that could be a lot. She remained active in many facets of her life, even after she retired. She continued to write and contribute to columns to the newspaper. She continued to correspond with people in her industry. She continued to attend an awful lot of theater, local theater. And she was also active in her synagogue. So, and a caring mother and grandmother. I don't want to leave that out. It's not like she was so self-consumed that she had no place in her family. She was very much of a family woman, without question.
Interesting. But she lived at a time when women didn't really have careers so much as they do nowadays, and certainly the types of jobs, the kinds of jobs that were open to women were limited back then in the 30s and 40s. And how did she happen to become the entertainment editor? And she was the entertainment editor of the Richmond Times Dispatch. How did
Yes.
that happen?
Couple things. Good luck was one to some degree. She told me that in the early days of particularly the talkies, the talking films, which mind you didn't come about until the late 20s, and so in the early 30s they were still in their infancy. Apparently, entertainment and movie reviews were not taken that seriously by at least the Times Dispatch, maybe other papers as well. And they were, I think it was considered a fluff job. She told me that the person who was doing the film critics at that time was usually whoever had the day off. It might be the sports columnist, it might be the guy who covered the General Assembly, it might be just most anybody who had the time to do it. But there was not a regular reviewer. And so when Morton G. Thalheimer kind of backed into the theater industry, and he did that. I mean, like I said, he backed in just by virtue of repossessing some properties that were notes that were owed to him that the theater owners couldn't pay, and so that's how he got into that industry. Though he wasn't really a movie person, and he hired somebody else to run the show. But he approached the Times Dispatch and said, it would really help us, the theater chain people and the other theater owners, if you had one person to do reviews consistently. That would help us an awful lot if we could get just one person. And they said, well, who do you have in mind? And my grandmother was best friends with his wife, Ruth Wallerstein Thalheimer. They were each other's maids of honor in their respective weddings. I suspect she had a lot of influence on recommending my grandmother to Mr. Thalheimer. And so he approached the Times Dispatch, paper that he did a lot of advertising in. So he had some influence and was able to say, my wife's got a friend, I'd like to send her down, give her an opportunity. And so that's what happened. So they said, send her down. And my grandmother went to the Times Dispatch and they said, show us what you can do. They said, go out and review these two movies. And she did, and they liked her work. And they said, well, let's keep doing this. And so she did, part-time at first, and they liked her work so much, they prevailed upon her to become a full-time columnist as well.
Wow, yeah, she interviewed, I guess she interviewed quite a number of Hollywood stars and luminaries,
Many,
people in the
yes.
entertainment world.
Right.
And how did she even went to Hollywood and interviewed them? And did the Times Dispatch pay for her to do that? How did all that come about?
She went to Hollywood on 3 occasions, and at least 2 of them, maybe all 3, were mostly at the courtesy of American Airlines, which was extending invitations to people like her to fly across country and hopefully say something nice about the experience, because airlines were also in their infancy back in the early 30s. At least, passenger travel, put it that way. The airplane was, not very old at that time, and most travel was by rail. So in a relatively new industry and in its infancy, they were promoting flights. And of course, the way you promote anything is you start by giving something away. And so that's what they did. They gave her tickets to fly to California and hopefully say something nice about the experience, which she did. And that's how she got there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Did she line up the interviews before she went, or how did she do that?
Not from what I can tell. I mean, from what I understand, this was, first of all, not unique to her. Hollywood, I think, was used to having reviewers, newspaper reviewers, come out and interview the stars and so forth. And when she did, they gave her the royal treatment, and they would escort her around to the various studios. And depending on what was being filmed in any particular day or any particular studio would be what she would have access to. So she would go and she would watch the filming of various movies, and at the break in between the scenes, she would be able to interview the actors at those studios.
Wow, yeah. Well, what were some of the famous people she interviewed? Tell us about that.
She interviewed quite a lot. I'm trying to, of the people that you would still probably know today. I think Clark Gable's probably still known by virtue of Gone with the Wind, and Judy Garland for The Wizard of Oz, and Jimmy Stewart for It's a Wonderful Life, and Walt Disney for Walt Disney, among others. So those were some of the people. There were, several more that were very big in their day. I mean, Mickey Rooney was certainly very big at that time. Jimmy Cagney was very big at that time. Excuse me, Bob Hope, another luminary that she interviewed as well, who remained big for several decades thereafter.
Yeah, yeah.
Those are just some.
Right. That's a pretty impressive list. Did she have any in particular that she found the most interesting or memorable, or why would they be?
Well, she was. Her favorite was Clark Gable, and I think for the reasons that Clark Gable was the favorite of many women during that era, because he was just, he was the model of male virility and his, good looks and so forth and so on. So that was her favorite. Though in her diaries, it would appear to me that she had a really rather warm affection for Walter Pidgeon, who is probably not as well known to your listeners today, but he was quite well known during his era. He seemed to treat her like an old friend every time they met, which was more than once. I mean, she met with him a few times, during the trips that she made to Hollywood, and he apparently was rather unpretentious and not stiff and not wooden like some of the other interviewees were obliged to be, I suspect. And he was just very down home, down to earth. So she really had quite a lot of admiration for him, as I remember.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Yeah,
Bill Robinson. I should add, Bill Robinson might be another one. Bill Bojangles Robinson. And
oh yeah, yeah. Well, he was from Richmond, wasn't he?
He was from Richmond, right? So I think she had a lot of appreciation for that.
Right, right. She also wrote some songs, didn't she? Tell us about that.
She did. She started writing songs much later in her career, after she had become established and was working at the Times Dispatch for a good 20 years or more. She started writing songs, which again was, kind of an accidental thing. She and my grandfather were apparently on some sort of a pleasure trip driving around the hill through the mountainous areas of Kentucky. And, at that time, this is in the either late 40s or early 50s, but at that time, the only radio was AM radio. There's no such thing as FM radio. There's no such thing as Sirius or Spotify or anything like that. So, you get what you get. And the only thing on the radio in that part of the country at that time was mostly country western. She referred to it as hillbilly music, perhaps not a flattering term, but that's the way she talked about it. And they were listening to the radio, and she said, "Good Lord, I could write music better than this." And my grandfather, who always believed in her talent, said, "So why don't you?" And so she did. She collaborated with a radio personality at WRVA. WRVA is still an active radio station in Richmond. A man named Carl Stutz, who wrote music, and my grandmother wrote lyrics. And they wrote several songs, though they only had one song that was a hit at the time of its release. It was a song called "Little Things Mean a Lot." It was sung by an artist named Kitty Callan, and it was the #1 pop song for 1954. So it was huge in that particular year. Her other songs were not nearly as successful, but they were some of them were re-released and recorded by other artists later. Tom Jones being one, who recorded a song that was originally recorded by Perry Como, a song called "I Know," which I still think is probably the best song she wrote. And then another song that she wrote, Willie Nelson covered in 1975. It's called "The Red-Headed Stranger," and it became the title cut for his album, "The Red-Headed Stranger," which really segued Willie into the pop stream. He was a country western artist who had some modest success, but not a great deal of success in Nashville. And then when he got fed up with Nashville, he went back to Texas and he recorded this album. And this album was a huge hit. Stayed on the charts for 127 weeks. And
Wow.
So she, still had success even after, good 20 years after she stopped writing.
That's really interesting. Well, tell us, what do you find what personally do you find most interesting about your grandmother and her career? I mean, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think what's most interesting is a couple things. That one, she, as you mentioned, for a woman of her era, that's just so remarkable that she would, have that kind of success. I think, she had it her way, if you will. When I say that, I mean, she was able to craft this career despite the fact that she was a woman. And, let's understand, this is the Richmond, Virginia. No one would confuse us with San Francisco or New York. And this is the 1930s, the capital of the Confederacy, and a very conservative institution. And at the same time, she was able to, secure a job, keep the job, have success at the job, and become something of a local celebrity. Her pictures with the Hollywood celebs were in her column time and time and time again. And, that made her very popular with the readers, who would probably be more interested in reading about what a woman who interviewed Clark Gable had to say than the guy who covers the General Assembly. That'd be my guess anyway. So that made her something of a rock star in her era. And then on top of that, she had the success with songwriting. I think, when I think about, what makes her so unusual, she was able to be an assertive individual. When I say, she kind of created her own path. And apparently she was able to make people like her at the same time. That's not an easy trick. It's not an easy trick to kind of get what you want and not alienate a lot of people along the way. But, she was able to work in this male dominated field, in a very conservative, publication, and stand her ground, and have her way, and apparently make them like her at the same time, which I think is pretty remarkable. I think for anybody to do that is pretty remarkable, and particularly during this era.
Well, she was obviously a remarkable woman. And the name of the book, let me just say that again for folks who may have missed it. It's called A Line a Day, The Private Thoughts of a Public Woman. If you go down to if you're watching this on YouTube, in the write-up under the video, there's a link to the page on Amazon of the book. And it's a fascinating story, a fascinating woman, and a really interesting book that I think a lot of people would like to read it. There are pictures in there of your grandmother, Edith, with a lot of the stars and that she interviewed back then. So do that. And by the way, if you have a book you want to have published, or if you need editing or ghostwriting help, I urge you to get in touch with me. You can do that through my website. There's a link to that below. But do go and find out more about that book, A Line a Day, The Private Thoughts of a Public Woman. It's really fascinating. And thanks so much for being with us today, Nelson. I really appreciate you having this conversation with us.
Well, Steve, thanks for having me, and thanks for your assistance on making this come into publication. I really appreciate that.